point where we need to get our formal program underway. I have been a member of the Smoky Mountain Historical Society since I retired here to live in God's country, having married a young lady who was born here in God's country, Jeanette Lee Clabo Beckwith. Raise your hand, Jeanette. I'm very proud of her. We were married in the First Baptist Church of Pigeon Forge, August 25th, 1950. You can do the math and figure it out. But when I joined, I became acquainted with some wonderful people. One in particular, a gentleman that at the first meeting I was to be involved in, I came to meet him at his office. He sold insurance for an insurance company. And there was something about that gentleman that I just got attracted to. We never became real close friends, but we were always friends here in the Smoky Mountain Historical Society. In all my life, I've been privileged to know him and really never had a chance to say what a great person he's been to this society. And some of you take him for granted. Off and on, he's been in leadership as a president, as corresponding secretary, and other posts, and always enjoyed it and never complained. An absolutely wonderful person. All my life, I've been privileged. I'm going to be able to invite a president. Think of it, a president I've known for many years, who's been president several times and is right currently Larry Douglas Fox. And Larry is our president now. I don't know how many times he's been president, but I know this. I went one day over to sitting with him at his computer. I don't know what we were doing, and the phone rang. And he said, "Look, what's this?" He was talking to a friend of his in Russian. Wow. Now, maybe there was collusion going on, I don't know. But Larry is an absolutely tremendous person. He has a long history of having served this country in the military, having done things that you and I probably could never be aware of. So it's my privilege to introduce the president of the Smoky Mountain Historical Society, Larry Fox. Let's give him a round.
Now I have been sabotaged because I have a script laying right here, and it's not here. It's the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month of 1945. Now, how many years ago was that? I think you'll find that was 73 years and 1 week. That the U.S. battleship, the Missouri, the USS Missouri, was anchored in Tokyo Bay. And there the representatives from all of the countries involved in World War II in the Pacific were there on board as observers when the nation of Japan came. I'm trying to find a good adjective to describe the way he came on board, because I thought it was comical when I saw it on the news film. He was short even for a Japanese, and he was dressed up in a top hat. In other words, a diplomatic uniform, as it were. Striped pants, striped tie, and he came aboard and gave to General Douglas MacArthur, who represented all of the Allied nations, his unconditional surrender, thus ending World War II. Now, that was a long, bitter experience. In fact, I had a friend who was a POW of the Germans during World War II, and he kept referring to that as the great unpleasantness. But the timing on this observance was not just happenstance. There was a reason for it. It was on the 11th day of the 11th month, at the 11th hour, 1918. Now, how many years ago was that? doesn't take much math. You know, it's exactly 100 years and 1 week when the armistice ending World War I went into effect. Now, it wasn't the end of the war. The end of the war didn't happen until much, much later, but that's when they quit fighting. That 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. When this happened at 73 years ago, this became one of our, well, we already had Armistice Day that we celebrated on that day. We then had VJ Day, that's the victory in Japan. We already had VE Day for victory in Europe. But now we got VJ Day, which was celebrated, but finally they kind of came together and they eventually made it, instead of VJ Day, they made it Veterans Day. And Veterans Day would become an annual event that was observed with kind of nice, and it's kind of rocked along until Vietnam. And by the time the Vietnam War had rolled around, our nation was so horribly divided that everything military, everything Vietnam became just a prohibited subject. And if the subject came up at all, it was almost violent. And we in the military were advised, don't go off base in uniform, don't go off post in uniform, because it might not be safe. Now, during this buildup, one thing aggravated it. We had an actual shooting, one killing on the campus at Kent State University, and this took a bad situation and then inflamed it even more. Now, I was not in the States at that time to see just how bitter it was. I was in Japan, and I went straight from Japan to Vietnam. So I missed out on all the full extent of all the bitterness. But when I came home from Vietnam, I'm dressed in my uniform, coming through the airport in San Francisco. Oh, San Francisco. You know what politics is like in San Francisco, don't you? I'm walking in uniform, walking through the airport, and this nice looking young girl, about 20 or so, I saw her come walking up to me, and I didn't know what was coming, and then she spit right on it. Baby killer! And you can imagine how I felt. I felt terrible. And time went on. Things military continued to be looked at with much disapproval, and time went by. And I retired out of the Air Force and I came back home. Where it wasn't really so bad, but we still didn't brag about being military or having worn the uniform of our nation in support, performing our duty. And one day, it occurred to me, Veterans Day had come and gone, and there wasn't a single word in print, and it wasn't a single word said about it, and I said so much to my pastor there at First Baptist Church in Sevierville. I says, have you realized you didn't say a word about Veterans Day? Well, I like to dwell on things of the spirit and not the things of the world. And I said, yeah. But I've been waiting all these years. I wore the uniform of my nation. I performed the duties that go with that uniform. And I am still waiting for my nation to forgive me for that. Well, that conversation ended and nothing happened. But then a year later, on Veterans Day, Sunday, we're in church at First Baptist Church in Sevierville, and when we walked into church, things were normal. People sitting there waiting, and all of a sudden, way back up in the back balcony, you hear a bugle blow. 3 notes. Do, do, do. And back over here on the other back, echo those same 3 notes. And we had these 2 bugles playing taps in echo. And then after they got through playing taps, you started hearing martial music. The choir is singing a patriotic song, and ex-GIs in uniform come marching in, each carrying their service flags. And as they came marching in, the choir, who's up been practicing obviously, they're singing the anthems of each of the services. You know, Anchors Away, and the tanks and the Air Force and the National Guard. I couldn't stand it. I loved it. Tears were running out of my eyes, and I just couldn't believe how good it felt to be honored. And as each of the service anthems were played and sang, they asked those veterans of that service to please stand and be recognized. I'm telling you, it was overwhelming. And that seemed to be the turning point, because our whole nation seemed to have picked up on it just about the same time. These veterans who came home from Vietnam and were not only mistreated or ignored, had nothing in common with the way they were treated coming home from Vietnam. From World War II, or even Korea. There was no honor. We were sneaking back into the country. Do not wear your uniform in public. And now we're being thanked. And this became the turnaround. This became the turning point. And I'll tell you, I felt so proud when people would come up to me and say, thank you for serving. And when people would come up to me and say, Larry, I understand you got a hold of the pastor and turned this whole thing around. Well, I'd love to take credit for it. I don't know how much effect I really had, but it turned around. Now, we have got these veterans that all have something in common. This sense of brotherhood, this sense of common experience that goes back World War I, which is far back as I can remember hearing about, and World War II, Korea, Vietnam, the Middle Eastern War, Iraqi freedom, and even in Afghanistan today. There are things we have in common. There are things that we feel such an affinity for each other for. We've got these shared experiences. Going through basic training and up 2, 3, 4, and firing a rifle, whichever rifle it might be, out in the blazing sun, out in the freezing cold, feet wet, feet frozen, all these common experiences that we have to share. We have differences, but even so, we have commonalities. Now, in World War I, we think about the nature of that environment. When I think about World War I think, okay, two things. Trench warfare, mustard gas, the Maginot Line, and weapons. They change over time, but there was the Benfield rifle. There was a Sopwith camel and what was his name? The one that Snoopy's, the Red Baron, that Snoopy was always fighting against. These are my memories of hearing about World War I. World War II was different, but we had commonalities. First of all, the weapons were different, the personalities were different, the events were different, but there were commonalities. Now, when I think of characterizing World War II, I see two major events in Europe. That's D-Day, and there's the Battle of the Bulge. And then you're in the Pacific, island hopping, names like Iwo Jima, Okinawa, that bring back such, I'm sorry, but heroism, as far as the weapons are concerned, don't like how they've been to a rifle. Now they got the M1 rifle, which I have fired, and I'll tell you, it's got a kick like a mule. Sand getting into everything, heat blazing down on you, and with all the people lying dead, the smell is unbelievable. And these are characteristics I think of from World War II. As far as the personalities are concerned, okay, let me go back to World War I. Kaiser Bill, or Kaiser Wilhelm. Now stop and think about that word, Kaiser. That was his title. But Kaiser was the German version of the word Caesar, which means absolutely autocratic power and an autocratic ego to go with it. And yet we beat him. Another word on the Russian front, there was Tsar Nicholas. Well, guess what? That Russian word, Tsar, means Caesar. And talk about a personality, talk about an ego. These are things that happened at that time. Now, come on down to World War II. Adolf Hitler, Benito Mussolini, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Harry Truman, General Dwight D. Eisenhower, General Omar Bradley, George Patton. In the Pacific, General Douglas MacArthur and Admiral Bull Halsey. These are names that are in the history books. And of all of these names, I think maybe George Patton excites the most excitement because he was old blood and guts. I heard a conversation one time between two of my high school teachers when one of them said something about being in the Third Army. And his reply was, "Oh, you were in the Third Army?" "Yeah." "Old blood and guts, Patton." I said, "Yeah, his guts, our blood." And that conversation ended. Well, guess what? A few years later, I heard the same conversation between two other veterans of World War II. When they found out that they were in the Third Army under George Patton, my goodness, the same reaction. Yeah, his guts, my blood. As far as the weapons, we went away from the Benfield rifle, now it's the M1. Now it's the B-29 bomber, the B-17 bomber in Europe, in Europe, and the B-29 bomber in the Pacific. We get things like I said, island hopping. We've got aircraft carriers. Well, guess what? We were not the first ones to use aircraft carriers. That's what Pearl Harbor was all about. Aircraft carriers came in there. So in response, one of the biggest things in the Pacific was when General Doolittle's raiders over Tokyo, those B-24 bombers, took off from a carrier. They didn't even have a place to land because they ran out of fuel before they could, but they bombed Tokyo. And you talk about exciting to our nation when that happened. They bombed Tokyo. And to be honest about it, nobody will admit this fact, but to be honest about it, those firebombs against those wooden and paper buildings did a whole lot more damage than the whole atomic bomb. Both atomic bombs did. And it was the beginning of the turning point of the war in the Pacific when we went on that raid against Doolittle's raid against Tokyo. We have, let me look at my notes because I'm getting lost. We talked about the personalities. Oh yeah, psychological warfare. This became on the rise during World War II. There was on the radio, there was Axis Sally in Europe. In the Pacific, it was Tokyo Rose. And in reply to these two, we had our own version of like Radio Free Europe and Armed Forces Radio Service and USO tours to help bring up the morale as opposed to their psychological warfare to tear down our morale. Entertainment, yeah, USO. But something else about entertainment. The newspaper that was distributed to all the GIs, the Stars and Stripes, had a guy named Bill Maudlin. He had these two famous characters, Willie and Joe. And Willie and Joe, I remember seeing one cartoon. Both of them were sitting there all scraggly, unshaven, unwashed, and Willie says to Joe, Joe, yesterday you saved my life. So today I'm going to give you the most precious thing I own. My last pair of dry socks. And you know, his cartoons, they really were well accepted by our GIs there in the field. Korea. We had differences. We had different names. We had different concepts. This mass influx across the line from North Korea into South Korea, and this was not specifically a U.S. operation, but it was mostly U.S. operation, along with our allies. And as far as the weapons are concerned, still the M1 rifle and the aircraft. We're getting into the jet age. We've got the F-86. That F-86 was one of the hottest things going at that time. And it was up against the MiG-15. Now, this word MiG, M-I-G, that is a combination of the two engineers who put it together, Mikoyan and Yakov. The MiG-15. Jet fighter against jet fighter, and they're both hot. Toward the end of the war, we started getting more advanced aircraft in there, and the communists brought in a new version called the MiG-17. Now, they had nicknames. The MiG-15 was called the Faggot. Now, that's got nothing to do with his sexual orientation. That is the name that they gave it. Now, here's the thing to keep in mind. If we give it a nickname and it's got one digit or one syllable, it is a propeller-driven plane. If it's got two syllables, it's a jet engine plane. So Faggot, two syllables, jet. Replaced, not replaced, but supplemented toward the end of the war with the MiG-17, which was the Fresco. And we have got the F-86. They're both hot. Move on down to the Vietnam conflict. Well, before we get to the Vietnam conflict, let me describe a particular incident. In this case of Korea, they were instigated, supplied, and motivated by the Russians, communists, whose intent has never been secret, to take over the world. And they were going to do it one country at a time. And they called it encirclement, where they're going to build a ring around the free nations, and they'll fall to one at a time. That was the intent of the Russians. It was stated, in fact, after Korea, in fact, it was 1953, if I remember correctly, Khrushchev, Nikita Sergeyevich Khrushchev, came to the United Nations, and he took off his shoe and he pounded on the podium and he says, "We will bury you. But we're not going to do it by open warfare anymore. We're going to do it through wars of national liberation." Now, what's that mean? Well, we saw it pretty soon. It was called Vietnam. Working at the instigation, motivation, supply of the Russian communists and the Chinese communists and the North Vietnamese communists, they started to try to take over South Vietnam. Now, they had a few homegrown dissidents, and they got organized and they got a name called the Viet Cong. The Viet Cong never was really that much. But on a very eventful day, Tet 68. Tet is their word for New Year's Day. It's a big holiday. On Tet 68, they rose up en masse. And they got slaughtered en masse. They got beat. They got wiped out. But the fiction continued that there still was a thing as called the Viet Cong. And what has happened is the North Vietnamese have started funneling regular NVA Army troops down the Ho Chi Minh Trail to try to take over South Vietnam. How they could continue, as a nation, how they continue to do this, I could never understand, because we're talking about a nation, North Vietnam, of about 17 million, and yet they are able to put year after year after year at least 200,000 troops a year down that Ho Chi Minh Trail into South Vietnam. And they called them Viet Cong. They were not Viet Cong, they were regular North Vietnamese army. And leader, Ho Chi Minh. Now who's Ho Chi Minh? Ho Chi Minh was a rebel leader, very charismatic, and he was able to bring up troops, guerrillas, to fight against the French, because at this time it's known as French Indochina. And he rebelled against, led a rebellion against the French. And guess what? Armed with, they were uniformed with shower shoes, sandals. And their transportation was bicycles. They would load a ton of supplies on a bicycle and roll it through the jungle. And with strictly guerrilla warfare, they defeated the French at Dien Bien Phu in 1954. And from there, he went on to become even more popular. He was the political leader. The military leader was General Giap, G-I-A-P. And they just kept right on keeping on. They're going to take over South Vietnam. So we started responding, with advisors, and then special forces, and then regular forces, and there I am right in the middle of it. I was terrified the first night I got there. But then my teeth started to get long, and my horns started to get long, and I started saying, I'm here to kill communists. But I'm not going to carry a rifle. I'm Air Force. So it's my job to work with my own crew and my own job to help win this war. And the longer I stayed there, the more militant I became. Because I could see what they were doing, I could see what we were doing. We had different weapons by then. Instead of the old Menfield rifle or the M1 rifle, it's now the M16. And let me tell you something, compared to the others, oh, it's a joy. I fired that M16 rifle, and you could fire that thing forever and ever and ever, because it had a protective layer on it that you could hold it. And even though the gun barrel may get so hot it's unbelievable, you could still hold it, and you could still fire it, and you could still aim it. That M16 was fantastic. As far as the dress was concerned, jungle fatigues instead of what we had been used to. Canvas boots. Now those canvas boots were they were fantastic development, because there we had to walk through the mud and the bogs and the swamp and the rice paddies, and they got wet, but they dried out. And they didn't weigh a ton each, but there's something we did have in them that became very necessary and very much appreciated. They had steel insoles, because their method of fighting was punchy sticks. Put that punchy stick, stick it down in the mud, and when you come along and step on it, the punchy stick will go right up through the boot and through the foot, and therefore disable a lot of people. But that steel insole made a big difference. As far as the weapons were concerned, besides the M16, aircraft. Boy, and aircraft carriers. The Navy had their aircraft carriers out there, and they were carrying these small, very powerful fighters. I got a blank, I'll think of the name. Skyhawk, Intruder, Crusader. And these are all super powered so that they can take off from that short runway on board an aircraft carrier. The Air Force, on the other hand, had other types of aircraft. Instead of the F-86 that we had in Korea, we're now the F-4, no, before the F-4, the F-105. Now that F-105, the Thunder Chief, but we didn't call it the Thunder Chief, we called it Thud, and never with an ounce of disrespect, because that Thud could carry more munitions than we packed on a B-17 in World War II. But to get it airborne, it took a full 2 miles of runway just to get it off the ground. But once it got off the ground, wow, it was something. And I'll tell you something. The nerve that it took for somebody to pilot one of those F-105s, unbelievable. One brain, one set of eyeballs, and steel nerves. And because they're all alone. Now along came the supplement or the replacement called the F-4, the Phantom, the Foxtrot 4C version, the Phantom, the F-4, 2 crew members. And then we got a new phrase that comes in here too. Now, in the Air Force, the pilots and the navigators have always had a friendly rivalry war going, where, you know, navigators say, we tell pilots where to go. And the pilots, they get disparaging remarks against the navigators, but now something special comes about. What we did is we took these navigators and gave them special training, and we called them EWOs, Electronic Warfare Officers, but that name never stuck. They had such specialized training, and they would fly one pilot, one EWO, but he was never called EWO, he was called the GID. GID? Yeah, that's the guy at back. And to get those two working together, it was something. The North Vietnamese, their weapons are like punchy sticks and ambush traps. AAA over the north. In fact, you know what AAA is, anti-aircraft artillery. And those, when the plane came over, their anti-aircraft artillery came up, and it would explode hopefully at the right level to kill American fighters. In fact, they would talk about it, they said, man, that AAA was so thick you could get out and walk on it. But they didn't. SAM. You know what a SAM is? A SAM is a surface-to-air missile. It looks like a flying telephone pole. And when that thing comes up at you, you're in a tight spot. And you gotta know it's coming at you so you can hopefully avoid it. And then you got to turn more quickly than it can because you've got wings and it's just got fins. So you can turn more quickly than it can and therefore hopefully escape the sand. Personalities. On the south, on the side of the Free Nations, General William Westmoreland, he was about halfway through, was replaced by General Creighton Abrams, and I worked for General Creighton Abrams there at headquarters MAC, the Military Command, Vietnam. The fighters, they were all assigned to, those who went up north were assigned to Thailand, the 5th Fighter Wing. The commander of the 5th Fighter Wing was a name that went down in history, was Robin Olds. Now Robin Olds was a double ace. Ace means he has killed 5 fighter jets. He was a double ace. He had killed 10. His deputy commander was Chappie James. Now, who is Chappie James? Chappie James was the first black American officer to reach the rank of full colonel. And he also was I don't know if he was a double ace before he got there, or if he became a double ace while he was there. But they made quite a team leading that 5th Fighter Wing. And they didn't refer to him that much by their own name. They were referred to as Black Man and Robin. And they were pretty good. They were very good. There was another name that became known, Dick Jonas. Oh, Dick Jonas, nobody ever heard of him, right? You never heard of him. I had the privilege of meeting him after it was all over on Okinawa. He was a captain, Air Force fighter pilot, F-4 jock, and he had the ability to put words together. He could put words together in rhyme and in song that caught on. And in closing, I'm going to recite something that courtesy of Dick Jonas. I'll tell you a tale that'll curl your hair. And I'll tell you the truth because I was there. About what happened in Ho Chi Minh's backyard. While the army is slogging through the jungles and the paddies, trying to erase those Viet Cong baddies, the gyrenes, the sailors, and the Air Force types, hot black smoke blowing from the hot tailpipes, were flying and fighting and living a life that's hard. We flew the valleys and the railroad lines from Dien Bien Phu to the Canto mines in a priceless high and measured in rich red blood. When tales are told in the halls of fame, when warriors speak, you'll hear these names like Skyhawk, Crusader, Intruder, Phantom, Thud. Black smoke, red Sam fire, pushing your luck right down to the wire. And then you pick them off and you boot that baby for home. But the battle's not over till you park and chopped. So when you fly and fight, keep your guns unlocked and don't try to fly and fight when you're all alone. What's that telltale wisp I see? That's a contrail pulled by a fish fed sea. And the cards are stacked and it looks like it's time to deal. The lead's got bandits at 12 o'clock hour, so swing around and scramble for sky and harm your goods. This ain't no game, it's real. Look around. There's a few empty chairs. Honored comrades should be seated there. Some are dead where they fell. Some fight on from a cell. Charge your glass. Raise it high. Drink to them.
Thank you, Larry. I really felt I never gave Larry the proper introduction he deserved. Would all of you stand and give Larry a good hand?